The next with a view of the future of scholarly communications, is Professor Dave DeRoe. He's the Professor of E-Research and Director of the Interdisciplinary E-Research Centre at the University of Oxford, bringing together social sciences, humanities and the hard sciences. He focuses on advancing digital scholarship and has personal research interests in web science, especially social machines, and in computational musicology, whatever that is. Thanks, Dave.
I'm going to talk about my perspective on the future of scholarly communications with emphasis on future. And Ross has told me it's okay to be provocative. So the backdrop to the whole of this talk is sort of captured in a couple of images here. This, as many of you will recognize, is the famous first publication of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society back in 1665, 1666, 350 years ago. And this was something, we kind of take it for granted now that this is what papers look like. But of course, at the time, it was a very, very significant step because it was the movement towards science actually being open. So we're talking about open science now, but 350 years ago, that was a revolutionary idea. It was so that scientists could stand on each other's shoulders, I suppose, rather than each other's toes. Now, a lot of things have changed in 350 years. I've just come back from the International Web Conference in Korea last week. And the web is one of those things that, we talk about the impact of the web. I'd rather talk about how societies harness the web to do new things. And lots has changed. But one of the things that curiously doesn't seem to have changed very much is how we do this. If we look at a more recent publication from Phil Trans, it looks awfully similar. It's a PDF. It's funny, isn't it? Because the web was sort of conceived by Tim Berners-Lee as, in the context of CERN, of science communication, of information dissemination, yet the one thing that doesn't seem to have changed is that. So this leads to one really important question, which is this approach still fit for purpose after 350 years? And that's the main thing I'm going to address. But it leads to a second very important question as well, which is why has it worked so well for 350 years? So we must be doing something right. Okay. So that's the balancing act in this talk. So I'm going to talk about four things. First, just really wearing my hat as a director of a multidisciplinary centre in Oxford to talk about the shifts I see going on in scholarship. I've trained as a scientist. I have this privilege of running a multidisciplinary centre where we work across all academic subjects, which I think is really important. There's no reason why research today or data today should respect these ancient disciplinary boundaries. As Ross mentioned, my personal research is in computational musicology, which probably sits in the digital humanities area. And actually I'm responsible for digital humanities in Oxford overall in a coordinating role. But also I've had 4 years working for the Economic and Social Research Council looking after a program called Digital Social Research. So I've been working on the intersection with social science as well. So all these things will come into the talk. If people ask me what I do, I know the answer. If they ask me what my discipline is, I have no idea. I hesitate to say post-disciplinary, although that has been suggested. Then I want to talk about, so is this the end of the article? And I'll do that with an anecdote. And then introduce an idea of what maybe it is that we're co-producing as an evolution of the article. And that kind of gives you a lens onto scholarly publishing, which I hope will be useful in the discussions today and over the next couple of days. And then another lens I want to give you at the end is this very briefly, this notion of social machines. Because I suspect, you may not know it, but many of you are social machines designers. So I'll explain why that is and why it's important. This is the big picture. This is a really big picture. It's a crazily big picture. And it's sort of very simplistic in many ways, but turns out to be quite useful for as a framework for discussion. So simply on the y-axis, let's use my pointy thing. Here we have the increasing numbers of machines, of devices, of storage, of cores, of processors. It's the technology trend. It's well understood by the industry. There were curves published. It's well managed. And then we have along the x-axis here the increasing number of people who are participating in the digital world, not just scholars, but citizens. And that's perhaps an axis that was less well understood and less well predicted. I mean, if you look back to 25 years ago, you don't find any papers in computer science or in social science predicting that the web was about to happen. We're not very good at the futurology piece. But that's really, the web is, and now apps on devices, it's very much enabling this movement along the horizontal axis. So this trend up there towards the big data and the big computing, high performance computing, we've seen a lot of investment in that over the years. In the UK, but globally, in the US, it was called cyber infrastructure. And it's sort of the high performance computing piece, and it's really important because it underpins computationally what we can do. Hasn't necessarily involved very large numbers of people, which may be a frustration for some of those investments. Meanwhile, everyone's just got on with doing research working digitally anyway, not because they've chosen some specific tool to solve their problems, but because they're just swimming in digital through the web, through the devices that they're using. And that's really the sort of more online R&D. It's the Science 2.0, Research 2.0 movement. And for the last 10 years or so, one of my frustrations has been the need to pull these things together, because it's almost created two communities and different conference series entirely. Those who are sort of E-hyphen and those who are something 2.0. And I think the really, really interesting space, the space we're in now, and the space where there's a lot of activity, is this top right area. And depending on my audience, I can put all sorts of different things in there, because it's whatever we're doing today. And last week in Korea, I was talking about, I was on a panel about information society, so I'm using information society. I quite like that because it plays to both axes quite well. The word society is really important. This is fundamentally about society in this space. But this is also the area that's underpinned by this notion of social machines, which I'll talk about later in the talk, just at the end. What's most interesting, because I said I was going to emphasize future, is to ask what happens next. Now that space is really interesting, it's where the action is, it's really complicated, it's where humans are using computers to do things they couldn't do before, so they're empowered. Sometimes it seems the other way around, it's crowdsourcing, it seems like it's computers using humans as sort of human subroutines, because we humans are still quite good at some stuff. So there's a really interesting interplay there. It's also where big data is being generated, because we're interacting digitally. It's where big data is being analysed, because we're using those facilities, but also we're using citizen science, for example, citizen sensing and citizen science. Really interesting space. I'm not saying everything has to be in that space. There are a few things that I think we should keep down here on the bottom left. Having just come back from Korea, I think air traffic control is best not left to Twitter just yet. But conventional computation is important too. Incidentally, computer science really understands this area very well and is beginning to understand this, and is now just beginning to look over on the top right here with computational intelligence, collective intelligence, wisdom of the crowd, and so on. Another word I want to just introduce, another term, while we're talking sort of neutrally about technology and about society, because I don't want to imply any one of those is majors over the other, is this nice concept of knowledge infrastructure, because in many ways that's what this talk is about and what this event is about, because knowledge infrastructure can be anything from a journal that we're discussing to a library to a university. It is, it could be a memory institution, it could be some of these much more computational things that I'm going to be talking about, but that's what we're building. It's knowledge infrastructure, and what this talk is really about is how does our knowledge infrastructure evolve in order to really support the new kinds of scholarship and the shifts that I'm going to talk about. So this is the really well-known shift. Back 10 years ago when we talked about the data deluge, as it was termed before people started calling it big data, we used to show a picture of the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, and it was very impressive, and we talk about these huge amounts of data that used to come out in terabytes, right? It doesn't seem so big now, although CERN is, of course, producing plenty of data. The significant change is that's happening across all disciplines. You can go to any department in a university or an R&D lab in a company and see people working digitally. So this is much more of a pervasive shift, and that's reflected in the UK at least by recently quite a big investment across all the funding agencies in the big data area. It's also well documented in terms of the change of methodology, the change of paradigm, if you like, that's associated with starting with the data rather than starting with a hypothesis and then doing the data collection through an experiment or a survey or whatever. So here are sort of a few examples. I like this paper because of the title. Here's the evidence. Now what's the hypothesis? The complementary roles of inductive and hypothesis-driven science in the post-genomic era. This is work where results were obtained absolutely because we started with the data. It wouldn't have come about the other way around. There's plenty of evidence of that. So you could say we're having a shift towards a data-centric view. You could be more extreme. I don't agree with the next example. The end of theory. The data deluge makes the scientific method obsolete. So we can argue here that actually the new things that we can do with data enable us to be new tools in our scientists and our researchers' toolbox, or you can argue more strongly that they actually make some other things redundant or obsolete. Similarly, what we're seeing in the big data world is quite an argument between sort of causation and correlation, where traditionally when we're trying to understand data, we try to understand what causes what, but maybe correlation is sufficient for many things, for example, prediction, and there's quite an argument going on, a scholarly argument going on about those two things. But again, there's value, there's new capability there. And then Microsoft, in their fourth paradigm book a few years ago now, managed to enumerate these paradigms and come up with 4. And I can't remember what paradigms 1, 2, and 3 are. And it's very odd because I work in social science and arts and humanities, where we start with the data or the artifact anyway, so I think of it as the first paradigm. But that is really a wonderful collection of essays about starting with the data and the change in science, the data-intensive, data-centric science. And I mentioned the investment across all the funding agencies. This is a RC UK, Research Council's UK picture, and I won't go through it all, but you can see the axes are quite interesting because it goes from commercial data on the left to commercial data on the left to research on the right, and from securely held data to open data. It covers the whole spectrum. It reminds us that this isn't just something in one discipline or just in academia, but it cuts across academia and business. And of these various investments that we see around the research councils, that top one in the middle, the yellow one there, social media data, is the one that I have an ongoing role as an advisor for in the Economic and Social Research Council. So I'll say a little bit more about social media as we go on. What that research council has done in the investment of big data is quite interesting, I think, because there's been a big investment in admin data with 4 centres, and then in business data, and now we're working on third sector and social media, and that's the current part of the programme. What's interesting to me about this is that, and we can see this in other disciplines as well, you can say that these new forms of data are new ways of answering some old questions. And maybe they're cheaper, maybe they're better. And they're sort of using these other forms of data collection as a lens onto society, so you can explore and investigate human behaviour. But actually, the social media one seems to be a special case, and I think that's relevant as a backdrop to our discussions here, because it's not just another form of data to see what people are doing. People are doing completely new things with social media. It deserves study in its own right. And also, you can argue against social media on the basis that, Twitter, that's not representative of the population, so we can't possibly use that. On the other hand, you can do studies now with Twitter that you just couldn't do before. If you want to look at the evolution of a social process in real time around an event like an election or around riots, then social scientists can do that. Oh, and incidentally, they've got a really big data challenge. They need new computational techniques. It's no longer sufficient to use what was a mainframe, what was a desktop, and is now a laptop. So that's the sort of shift we're seeing going on in social science. Interestingly, the House of Commons has picked up on this. This inquiry, select committee inquiry, closed a week or so ago. But this is the government being interested in what's going on in social media data, and specifically in real-time analytics. So this whole real-time thing is really beginning to kick in a significant way. And as a great example of that, and I want to use this example because it is what I'll come back to at the very end, and then also an example of changing behaviour and changing roles. The summer riots in 2011, if you haven't looked at them, the coverage of this from the Guardian newspaper and this sort of reading the riots project is very, very interesting. There's lots of really good visualizations where people are studying the social media during that process, which of course was part of the rioting process itself. It wasn't just a lens onto what was happening, it was part of what was happening. And it's interesting how journalism has changed there. So instead of a journalist looking at Twitter, finding out how to, where to go to get the latest information to report, actually the citizens are reporting. And the journalists started asking the critical questions to work out what was fact and what wasn't. And this study afterwards is really interesting. It's about rumours. And these are some of the rumours that occurred during the riots on Twitter. The London Eye on fire, for example, or the animals from London Zoo escaping. And you can look at Twitter and you can look at the behaviour of these different discussions and spot their characteristics and work out what's a fact and what's a rumour. But it's really interesting because It's an analysis that you can only do now with social media, and it's in particular an analysis of a new social process. And in particular, it's an analysis of a social process that's absolutely in the hands of the citizens. Right? So there's some very significant social changes going on there worthy of study. What we see, not just in ESRC, but here, for example, in the program called Digital Economy, which some of you are aware of, which involves the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council and also Arts and Humanities, is also a change in research methodology with a lot of emphasis in this notion of in the wild. So instead of studies, sort of quote subjective studies, where you do things in a lab or you collect some data and then you study it and you report on that. This is really about getting our hands dirty. It's going in there, doing things for real, with real people in quotes in the wild. There's a nice sort of catchphrase that's being used to distinguish this approach, the in the wild approach, from other approach, which is in it versus on it. So this is actually doing the research in it, in the wild, rather than on it. And that's quite a significant methodological shift that's going on. Many, we would argue that many of the areas of research we're doing now require that change. So what does that mean for scholarly communication? And then another thing in that fourth quadrant of my diagram where lots of people come together, as I mentioned, the crowdsourcing and the citizen science piece. So Zooniverse really initially was Galaxy Zoo, using 165,000 people to help classify spiral galaxies. Because humans are better at this than the computers at the moment. That may change. And now that project was the first of the sort of Zooniverse set of projects. They've gone on to have many more astrophysics projects. They also have humanities projects. The latest one of the recent ones is World War I Diaries, Operation War Diary. Up to 1 million people now engaged in this. Now, is this crowdsourcing? Is this computers using humans to do things that computers aren't good at yet? Or is this citizen science? It's very interesting if you look at Galaxy Zoo, that there is this sort of data reduction piece where humans are classifying stuff, and then scientists are using the results of that. But something else happened, which is new discoveries were made. There's something called Hanny's Vorwalk. There's also the green peas. You can read about all these online in Wikipedia, for example. And what's going on is that the humans are also interacting through discussion fora, talk fora, becoming experts on particular bits of the science, interacting with each other, effectively building this kind of machine, this social machine, around the science, and new things are coming out of it, and new publications are coming out of it as well. So, how many authors are there on these publications? Well, very large numbers, as well as the publications the scientists are making. So this is, again, a shift in methodology. So you've seen multiple shifts there. So with that backdrop, I'm now going to come on to the article. And the little anecdote, and some of you were there for this, is that at the Beyond the PDF 2 event last year, when you registered for the event, you got to put down your vision for the future of scholarly communications in 100 words or something, which I did, because you do that as part of registering. Then to my surprise, just ahead of the event, I had an email, subject, results of the jury. We're sorry that your vision hasn't been accepted. However, would you like to present a poster? Now, I found that quite provoking. A poster? Beyond the PDF too? Really? But I rose to the challenge, and because I was travelling at the time, in from Hong Kong, I didn't want to carry a poster, so I got a colleague in Amsterdam to print out, as you can see, 6 pieces of A4 for me on his home printer, and that was my poster, and I put this up at dinner at the Beyond the PDF event, and then I went and hid. And what I did, or watched from a distance, in it, not on it. No, on it, not in it. Whoops. What I did was, being slightly provoked by the whole event, wrote a paper where the thought experiment was, it's now 400 years after philosophical transactions. And as I'm a student, and as part of my narrative class, I'm writing a report in the style of a paper about the history of the paper. And I really did this so that on one of those pieces of A4 there, I could have a section with the subtitle, Period of Confusion, and describe the Beyond the PDF event. The previous slide, the previous piece of paper was the one that attracted attention, because as I hastily wrote this, I wrote a section that said, the demise of the paper around 2030 can be attributed to several factors, then 8 points. And that's the thing that everyone saw. And I became the end of the article guy. And I have given a talk with the word scholarly demise in the title. So if you ever want to find it, just Google me and scholarly demise. And I'm just going to flick through these. I haven't changed these slides since I did this. So I presented this on a Monday in Amsterdam. By Friday, Oxford University Press had asked me to present them to some journal editors. And these are the slides I did for that. I hadn't changed them. I think it's interesting as an anecdote. I hadn't thought awfully hard about any of these things, but it turns out that there's some interesting things in here. So the first is no longer possible to include everything you need in one of these things called a paper. The paper, this wonderful knowledge of unit knowledge that we exchange. This is actually partly a true story. I was at the RPE event 2 years ago in a panel discussion, and one of the points that was made was, perhaps we could put data to reproduce experiments inside PDFs. Well, you can't do that with Twitter. Sorry, it blows up. I'll go through these quite quickly. Another is that you actually need loads of stuff now to reproduce an experiment. It might be different to what Isaac Newton might have done. But there's a subtle point in here which I'll mention briefly and would love to discuss in more detail later, because I'm quite frustrated by this. And it's around the notion of reproducibility. So I don't know how many of you are scientifically trained. I was originally. But you're taught that the scientific method and reproducibility is fundamental. And one of the things that happens, for example, if you're a physicist, is you'll do something in a lab with your experiment, with your apparatus in your lab, and you'll get some results, and maybe they were the results you were looking for, but you have no idea whether that was some peculiar thing that just happened in your lab with your kit. What you really want is someone else to have a go at this and see if they can reproduce those results. So that's good. That's what I think reproducibility is. And then there's this whole movement at the moment, and some of you may accidentally be part of it, about reproducible research, which basically says, we have to capture everything. We need the software, we need the data, we need absolutely everything from that experiment. It all has to be open. We have to make it all available so that we can reproduce the research. Well, that's like exporting my lab, the experiment, my samples and everything, and getting someone else to do it. That wasn't reproducing my results. That was reconstructing. It's useful. It's very useful, and we shouldn't not do it. But be careful about reproducibility. Reproducibility has some variation. There's some independence in there. And we might be taking steps against that. This is the quote from my poster. This tenet of the scientific method based on independent reconstruction of experiments suffered when the sharing of digital artifacts seriously interfered with the notion of independence. Sharing was at once beneficial and self-defeating. That's one of my little provocative rants. And then research today is hugely multidisciplinary. We tend to write for increasingly specialist audiences, and that's how the whole review process works as well, but that doesn't work for the multidisciplinary reuse. Another interesting point, I love this elephant in the data center, the big data elephant in the big data center, is that computers are users too now. I mean, we have to think about, for my original diagram, the computational side as well as the human side. But that doesn't mean that they replace us. The picture on the right I quite like. It's what we do in scholarship. It's the sense-making network. Where academics and scholars and researchers are exchanging what were papers, but now machines are part of that network as well. And the question is, what are the artifacts we should be exchanging as well as papers or instead of papers? So that's really bringing in the computers as users too. You know this one, and we've seen it in the examples already, that we need Hollywood-style credits for the research teams that are delivering research. And this one, which is we've got this increasing volume of publishing at the front of the pipeline, where originally we might say with the whole process of publishing filters and then publishes, and now people are publishing and the filtering has to go. And it's always, of course, filter, publish, filter, publish, filter, publish. But how does that pipeline scale when there's a lot more coming out at the front of it? And how do we manage or throttle that for all sorts of reasons of quality and cost? Also, we don't just publish papers. We have to write loads of other reports as well. Wouldn't it be nice if we could do all that in the same process? One of the reasons we might want to write other kinds of reports is for regulatory compliance. And wearing my funder hat, if I'm about to invest money in a project that's going to do some data collection and some analysis, that investment was worthless if the results of that project can't be found. It's still worthless if they can be found but they're not reusable. It's particularly effective if, as they're used, it adds value. And we can do things so that reuse adds value. So there's a sort of a social added value layer that comes in as well. And there's an interesting brief anecdote here. I got to talk to this chap at the bottom here, Gary Kasparov. You know him for chess. He writes about innovation now and makes interesting observations about innovation having slowed down. And I had this discussion with him a while back where I suggested that perhaps one of the reasons innovation slows down is if we're using an obsolete scholarly communication mechanism, as you can imagine I might say. At which point he caught me out by saying, so what am I doing about it? And so the answer is, of course, I'm using an obsolete scholarly communication mechanism to come to conferences and to write papers. And yes, okay, I see the problem. Good point. So all of this, as I move into my research objects now, reminds us that it isn't just about data, it's what you do with it that counts. And it feels at the moment like data's just been discovered. Everyone's having data management plans and data research and management landscapes and investments, and that's really important. It's great, and we should celebrate that. But it's what you do with it that matters. And it's funny that data seems like it's just been discovered when we have been using it for some time. And really, I want to balance that with the method. On a good day, I will argue that the method is actually more important than the data, but probably not today. And there's all sorts of things in there. From a technical viewpoint, it's software, it's programs, it's workflows, it's the modeling, it's all sorts of things which we may use as part of the research process, the method. And really that's what papers capture, that's what articles capture. It's the method. So that's what we should be looking at as this evolves. And we must remember to balance those two things. It's what you do with it that counts. Just to mention software then, in passing, because this is a really important point, because now everyone's talking about data, are they also talking about software? If your university has a research data management committee, is it also looking at software? It probably should be. It's a scholarly output. It's part of the methods. It's a kind of data. But it tends to get neglected and taken for granted, and that's a very dangerous thing. And it's really good to see some journals and some publishers embracing software and the sustainability and the curation of software as part of the scholarly process. This is a slide from the Software Sustainability Institute in the UK, who do a lot of really good work in this area and associated with some software publications like, Open Research Computation. And then this is a website that I've been involved in for many years. It's just a Web2 site where scientists exchange actually the artifacts here are things called scientific workflows. They're the computational workflows. They're data analysis pipelines. They're the things you may use in bioinformatics or in digital humanities to do some analysis of this data coming in. And it's not a huge site. It's a sort of boutique site. That's on the workflows tab there. We've got 2,500 workflows. It's quite interesting to watch because people use workflows across multiple disciplines. What's been interesting about this site is that very, very early on, about 2007, we added functionality so that people could not just share one of these things, but actually throw in other bits and pieces as part of their research that they wanted to associate with it. They wanted to put PDFs, papers in, they wanted to put PowerPoint slides in. But we didn't constrain what they could put in. We said you can just put anything you like into these bundles, and we called them packs. And that notion is it's an interesting co-evolutionary exercise to watch what people actually do. We've done an analysis of all the packs that have been created. What it is that researchers in different disciplines actually want to package together to share their research. So what are these bundles? Because that might give a clue as to what sort of things we might want to share instead of, or as well as articles. That's evolved. So initially it was workflows. We extended it to this notion of packs. We've just come to the end of a European project called Workflow Forever, which is looking at how that evolves into these things called research objects, and that suggests some standard ways of dealing with these assemblies, these collections of stuff. The next phase I would suggest is actually that computers are users too, and we close the loop here by looking at computer use as well. So that's been a really interesting evolution. And I would, if people want to know more, there's a researchobject.org website, and there are various documents there. But the interesting point I want to make, I think, goes back to the reproducibility point, which is what are the characteristics of these shared objects? So this is where we go back to what's good about papers. What's good about papers, why it's worked so well for so long, might be because they're social objects. They're how we come together, we have discourse about them, we build social networks around them. They aren't just lumps of data. They are they're actually also proxies for our reputation. It's essential socially that they're citable. So there's just so many aspects of the social object that is a paper that we have to bring into this. It isn't just a load of data on a disk somewhere. And that's really what we've learned through my experiment experience, what we learned from methods. It is really about making those things first-class citizens. And this is kind of a word game that's been going on for a few years. So fairly early on, I tried to describe what by looking at the research objects that people have created, I tried to describe what it is the characteristics of these things. How did they play into research? How did they behave? And we started this R-word game on a blog, and it's been going on for several years now. We're up to 21 R-words. And that isn't actually just a bag of R-words that you see in front of you. It was 19 last week. 2 have come in the last couple of days. These are actually categorized, and this really deconflates that whole reproducibility piece. So the ones along the top are very much the scientific method. But then there's that point that there's no point in having this stuff unless you can actually access it, and there's no point in accessing it unless you can actually understand it. And better still, you want to make new use of it. So exactly the points I was making earlier. And then the whole social dimension. And this isn't just a load of data on a disk. These are social objects that are shared by scientists in that scholarly sense-making network. And finally, of course, the curation, preservation, archiving aspects as well. There are many more R words. They're not all on here. The next line would probably be finance, and it would have recyclable and repayment. And perhaps I'll add those, and then we'll be up to 23. But this fits quite comfortably. I've tweeted that image already today. Last week we tweeted one with 19 words on, so do what you like with it. And if you want to find out more about the whole research object piece, we have this researchobject.org website, and there are various papers and standards on there that have come out of the projects we've been doing. But I'm not sort of saying this is what everyone should be using. I'm just saying this concept of the research object, the collection of stuff associated with an experiment, but formed as an object, a social object, an artifact that we can exchange, is the evolution of the article. The article itself might be part of that. But it's that the answer isn't an article pointing at a load of data on a disk. It is to think about this as an object, as a research object. There are challenges in that. We're dealing at the moment with pearls and DOIs for research objects. It's a bit tricky. If a research object contains other objects, which are stored in different places, it does rather upset some of the processes, social processes we have in place for issuing DOIs, for example. That's something we're working hard on at the moment. So to close, let me mention this social machines thing to give you another lens. And I think with the research objects piece, I'm very interested to see how that plays into tomorrow morning's discussions about multi-channel sort of academic output, because I want to know what the research objects are when you're working multiple channel. That's a very interesting thing to think about tomorrow morning. This is the other lens I want to give you. This is a quote from Tim Berners-Lee, 1999. Right? It's going back to his Weaving the Web book. Social machines on the web, processes in which the people do the creative work and the machine does the administration. An important definition, because it isn't saying humans are replaced by machines, it's saying humans are empowered by machines. And then although people don't always put the whole of the quote in, the rest of the quote is significant. The ability to create new forms of social process will be given to the world at large. And I've given you an example of that with the Twitter analytics around reading the rights and the whole new kind of social research that we can do that we couldn't do before. This is absolutely about citizens being empowered not just to create content, but to create process, to do new things with the media. I suspect that's what you're doing in some of the websites that you're designing, some of the services that you're offering, some of the new workflows that are being created. So that's why I suggest to you that you are social machine designers. I won't go through all the examples, but a classic example of a social machine would be Wikipedia. This is not something that was built by doing a requirements analysis and then some developers building a system. It's something that's been created, and all the etiquette and protocol around retractions, around who can do what, has evolved over time and is different in different countries. And that proves that the behavior is socially constituted. And that's one of, I think, the definitions of a social machine. It wasn't programmed by the programmers, it's actually programmed by the citizens. And Wikipedia is a great example also because it's possibly in decline. There are papers about the decline of Wikipedia, which reminds us that social machines evolve. They have a life cycle. And actually, it's not clear to me that you can just sort of get some requirements, design a social machine, and release it into the wild. It's a much more complicated picture that we're trying to understand, where you sort of design a social machine as an intervention into the ecosystem so that in combination you get the desired behavior. That's probably what you're doing as you release websites and new services in the scholarly publications area. We talked about Twitter. You can argue that every hashtag on Twitter is a social machine. That's an interesting discussion. But clearly, again, Twitter is just a communications infrastructure. What's being done with it is socially constituted. Many other examples there. And this is the sort of cartoon that was drawn at the aforementioned Beyond the PDF2 event last year in Amsterdam. And it's sort of, to me, a picture of the scholarly ecosystem. One of the things you can do is think about what are the social machines that are evolving. What are the websites, if you like, the Web 2 sites that are evolving within that ecosystem. And I gave a talk at the Joint Conference on Digital Libraries last year with this slide, and I put these particular things on there then, but I've already said that social machines evolve. So already some of those things have changed, some have gone, new ones have appeared. Sort of mapping the ecosystem, not thinking of just individual social machines, but taking an ecosystem perspective and looking at the combination of interacting social machines and how they interact, is how I suggest that we can study and figure out how to design for the future of scholarly communication. So to close, I've indicated some shifts in scholarship. It isn't just done the way it used to be. We've got the data centricity, we've got entirely new things happening like the social media analytics. Is that just a shift? Is that a computational turn that we've been through? It will take a few years, different times and different subjects, and then it's done? Or is that an ongoing, really quite rapid transformation? Discuss. Is it the end of the article? Well, what I really want to do here is say a lot of our discussions about retrofitting what you do digitally now in existing disciplines, existing practices, existing scholarly practices. But can we just stop that for a second and say, no, let's think post-digital. Let's not use the old barriers that were there. Let's just think, we've got digital now, where will we be tomorrow? Try and get that future discussion going as well, because I think that's very important to show us where we're going. Then this notion of research objects, I suggest this is going to happen anyway, because there's just so much stuff out there associated with our research as we do experiments, some physical, some digital. We have to be able to cluster it, we have to be able to manage it, we have to deal with all those issues of citation and preservation. I think in different ways, many of us are tackling the same problem. We have a little advisory group for our research objects activity if people are interested in more around there. And then finally, there's social machines reminding us that this is actually about humans being in the loop. That sense-making network of humans and machines, and a suggestion that maybe that's a lens that you can use to look at and discuss some of the things we're seeing over these 3 days. Thank you very much.